I'm going to walk you through the 8 hours it took to create this oil painting. I'll talk about specific art supplies, how to break down brush techniques, and color mixing. When I'm starting the initial sketch for the painting, I approach it as if it's one big gesture drawing. I'm trying to capture all of the fundamental aspects of the image. I'm also in a mindset that I can make a lot of changes. What's nice about making changes at this point is that it's pretty fast. I always keep my rag handy, very easy for me to go in and wipe things out. Another thing that a lot of people tend to forget about is to really be looking at your thumbnail sketch the whole time that you're doing this initial painting sketch. A lot of the times I've seen people work really hard in their thumbnails, but then they don't refer to it when they're starting the painting. And I'm really making sure that the proportions I've created in the thumbnail are matching what I am laying out in the painting. This composition has a really distinctive diagonal where you have the tree anchored in the upper right-hand corner and then this flood of orange that just cascades downwards to the lower left-hand corner. And then you have these shapes of the trees in the background, which I think are more like an accessory. What I'm really trying to lead with is this lean of the hill moving downwards. In this beginning sketch, I'm trying to capture the biggest shapes that really characterize the composition. In this case, it really has a lot to do with this diagonal of the orange ground moving into the lower left-hand corner. And then you have the tree, which I really see as being an anchor for the piece. The piece to me starts up here and then descends downwards. That's the main compositional element that I really need to emphasize at this early stage. The surface I'm painting on is an artist panel, and this is created by Ampersand. It's an all-primed wood panel. You can start painting on it right away, and it is a super smooth surface. For me, I have found it to be really important that I have an underpainting. You can see in this painting, I've actually left quite a bit of this turquoise of the underpainting. Sometimes people have underpaintings where they completely cover it up, but I ended up really liking this turquoise color, which is very cool, and having it right up against this really saturated orange. One of the best things about an underpainting is that it just covers your entire painting surface. Then you don't have to deal with that white of the page. There's so many different ways you can do an underpainting. In the past, I've done this default burnt sienna background. One thing that all underpaintings have in common is that they're very, very thin. Because this panel is so smooth, I decided to go with Sennelier abstract acrylic inks. This one is turquoise. A way to think about an underpainting is to do the complementary color. If you know that your painting is largely orange, having a blue color as an underpainting is a great way to get instant color contrast. Another reason is that I've always struggled with color, especially saturated colors. I was really terrified of using for a long time, but I watched Lauren Welch do this amazing sink painting where she had a super bright magenta background. And I like that idea of having something that was super saturated to begin with and then reacting to that because every single color I put onto this painting is essentially a reaction to what's happening in the underpainting. And so I thought if I started with something that was super saturated, then I could resist the temptation to get all muddy and brown like I used to. I decided to try solvent-free oil painting. Having a home studio, I don't want to be using something like a solvent, like Gamsol, which is going to create fumes. The oil paints that I'm using are these Geneva oil paints, and they're different than most oils because they have slow dry medium already mixed into them. They're a lot runnier than most oil paints for that reason. I know they were created with the intent to do alla prima painting, and they have a very slow dry time. They're a lot more runny than other oil paints, and I found that I really did not need to use any solvent-free fluid in order to spread around the canvas. It was totally fine using it straight out of the tube. With the initial sketch done, the next stage is to really establish the color relationships and the biggest shapes. I started out by tackling this orange area because this relationship between the blue underpainting and the orange was such an important color area for me to establish. When you're trying to mix a color, I will do as much work as I can on the palette, but what is really important is that I take that color and I put it right on top of the painting. Oftentimes, the color that you mixed on the palette, it can completely change its personality once you get it onto the painting, because the painting has all these other colors that are part of this conversation. And so sometimes you'll mix an orange and you'll find that on the painting it just behaves really differently. The process is mixing it on your palette, putting it on the canvas, evaluating each one and saying, well, I need to lean this one a little bit more orange, maybe it needs to lean a little bit more red, and you keep going with those swatches until you find the one that really looks like what you're trying to do on the canvas. You don't want your palette to trick you. So don't trust your palette. You got to get it on the canvas first. The oranges in here are so much more saturated than what's in my reference photo, but for me, that's extremely important that I start out with colors that are too saturated, knowing that ultimately, as more colors get mixed into them, they're going to naturally become more and more muddy. Out of all the different types of paint media, I think oil is the toughest in terms of getting really fresh, bright colors. I know my early oil paintings just turned to mud so fast. Adding all of these super bright colors is a way for me to preempt all those muddy colors from happening. Even though this is still really early on in the painting, I do need to be thinking about my brush technique. Sometimes I see paintings where people will do a sketch and it's almost like they're coloring in some of those shapes, but the brush really has to follow the nature and personality of what you're painting. My brush technique is something I never really thought I was very good at. And in retrospect, I think I used to hide my brushstrokes too much. And for that reason, I missed a lot of opportunities to really articulate the form in a much more expressive manner. One thing I really deliberately tried to avoid in this painting was a brushstroke that stayed the same width the whole way through. Now, if you have a brush that's like this, and you take this brush and you just paint it downwards and you keep the exact same pressure, you're going to end up with a brushstroke that is the exact same width the whole way through. One way to really vary that up is to change the physical pressure you're exerting on the brush as you're creating one stroke. For example, you could start a paint stroke where you're putting a lot of pressure on the brush. Then, as you move along, maybe you lift up your brush so it's not so much pressure, and then maybe you go back to exerting more pressure. That creates so much more variety in your brush strokes, so it doesn't feel like your brush strokes are just doing the same thing over and over again. You'll see in a lot of these areas that some of the strokes, they start more like shapes actually, and then they get very thin and turn into lines. I'm really trying to get my brush to make shapes. I try to get the stroke thing out of my head because if you make brush strokes that are not lines, you actually don't have to do as much work because one stroke can express three different types of shapes Whereas if you're just doing the same stroke over and over again, it's a lot more work to get that variety. I find the way that I physically hold my brush makes a huge difference in terms of what I can do. Typically, most people, if you gave them a brush, they probably hold it like this, the way that they might hold a pencil. Now, the issue with this is that you have a very tight grip over the brush. And so if you think about how far I can rotate my brush, that is very, very limited. The other thing is if you hold it down here towards the bottom, that also limits how much your brush can do. I'm always having to remind myself to not do that. I think one of the reasons we do this is because it just feels like we're so much more in control of the brush. But the thing is, the more tight control you have over your brush, the less likely you are to create a more gestural, expressive stroke. One thing that's helped me a lot is instead of holding it like this, I'll hold it like this. So I'm holding the brush at the very end, and you can see if you hold it at the end, how much your brush can do. Now, the problem with painting like this for a lot of people, at least at first, is that you don't feel like you have any control. It feels way too loose. But that's where you have to let the brush have some spontaneity. If you're being a complete dictator with your brush, it's unlikely that you're going to get that range. I kept my thumbnail sketches super simple. Typically, I like to use multiple reference photos. It just gives you more opportunities for different types of compositions. But I knew that the purpose of this painting was to try a new paint brand and to learn how to use solvent-free oils. And I really wanted to focus on my brush technique and also some color. Now, that's a lot of things to have to handle in a single painting. I told myself that the point of this painting is not composition. I'm here to do these other things. And so if I spend way too much time doing a really complicated composition, that's going to make focusing on those other aspects a lot more difficult. You can see in the thumbnails, a lot of it is about the scale relationship between the tree and the ground. Ultimately, I ended up making the ground and the tree about the same size, but then the background is so much bigger. But I think that's okay because I knew I wanted something very blurry back here, very low in contrast, and I wanted the tree to really feel like it was sprouting out of the composition. This is a reference photo that I shot when I was traveling in southern Utah, and these are essentially trees where there's been erosion. And so these trees have these incredibly complex root systems, but all of the ground underneath them has fallen away. And these, to me, they really look like creatures, as if they've gotten up from the hill and are walking downwards. And even though I know it's a tree, this is not really a tree to me. I guess it's a naughty, twisted octopus. That's a really simple narrative that I created for myself that I find is very helpful. So that way I'm not just relying on the visuals of the reference, but I've really thought about this way to tell a story, even though it's super simple. Of course, I'm using my rag to clean my brushes, but it's my best friend when it comes to being a painting tool. The nice thing about the rag is that it creates a sense of tension and movement in your strokes. Sometimes I put down a big stroke of paint and it just ends up looking really blobby, as if it has no structure at all. But the thing about the rag is I can put down an amount of paint, and then when I take my rag and I push the paint across the surface of the painting, you get this beautiful tension in the stroke, which makes it so that your painting doesn't look so blobby. Something I did not anticipate with the rag work this time around was seeing the underpainting through the orange because I had lifted away with my rag. The other thing about a rag is you can make it all different shapes. If I want to make it really big and wide like this, I can just wipe away a big area. Or if I just take my finger and I stick my finger under it, I can get marks like this, which are very thin. It's such a versatile painting tool, and I feel like it really helped me organize the tree so it didn't just end up looking like these soft octopus tentacles everywhere. I had a lot of cases with the rag where I would put down a dark stroke with the paint, but oftentimes it ends up looking like the stroke is just painted on. What the rag achieves so well is when I take it and I push it across that stroke, it immediately softens the edges. And that really allows that stroke to really feel like it's deeply immersed in the painting. And that's something that I think is much harder to do with a brush. What was really challenging about this image is that it has so many roots and branches everywhere. I'm the type of person, I do not enjoy painting every single leaf on the tree, and it's so easy to get lost. What does help me though is to identify a couple of specific focal points, areas that I want to really pop out. So that way, there are other areas where I can be a little bit more chaotic and feel like I can just make up the marks instead of really being so stuck on my reference photo. This was a very large form that really popped forward. So this was a really important focal point where these two forms come together. Definitely what looks like an eye in this upper section. And then you can see the upper right-hand corner. This is a very large section of the tree that then created this very dark hole. Between this, and this, it was enough for me to hold the painting together and feel like I wasn't just moving around totally aimlessly. I also find the more I work on the painting, the less and less I'm looking at the reference photo, especially in an area like this, where it's just these chaotic grasses moving all over the place. I don't need to get in there and paint stroke by stroke exactly what I'm seeing. What's more important is that I capture the direction and personality of the strokes. These are all strokes that are moving upwards, they're going in all different directions. And you can see I've done quite a bit of dry brushing to make sure that the paint doesn't look too thick. It has to have this wispy, very thin quality. And same thing over here. I was just thinking, oh, okay, there's a little patch of grass that's happening in there. I don't have to paint exactly every single blade of grass, but I can dance across this with my rag to pull out some textures that are reminiscent of the grass. Getting to this point in the painting took me 8 hours. There's still quite a bit of work that I want to do. Largely, it's the glazing that I want to start to create a lot more color variation. I think it's okay in the beginning of a painting to not think about color so much. When I was working on this tree area, the larger priority was actually value. And so you can see I use these very deep alizarin crimson and ultramarine blacks. There's a couple highlights of yellow just to make sure that that white doesn't end up looking super pasty. What's really great about where the painting is now is I have a really solid structure and form established, and that will allow me to do a lot more subtleties in terms of the color mixture. I'm surprised by this painting. I haven't painted in about 20 years, and I was nervous about making this painting, but I was really happy about the underpainting. I feel like the underpainting color was the best decision that I made in the entire painting. And it never occurred to me that I would leave some of the underpainting showing. In my past pieces, I've always covered them up entirely, but I found that this color relationship created such a beautiful depth with the wiping of the rag. It shows you can have so much training in one area and still have so much to learn about different materials, but also in terms of the making of the painting. I just discovered this technique with this painting. What I achieved in this painting that I think I didn't achieve at all Many years ago, when I was focusing on oil painting, there's a freshness to this painting in terms of color and also in terms of my marks. In my early oil paintings, I used to just blend everything away. I also had a lot of very crisp graphic edges, which made things look really flat. So you notice in a lot of these areas that the edge of the tree actually disappears and is not very well defined. It's so nice when your work surprises you.